Okay, so welcome to my talk. It's titled Developing a C2 Framework, but really we're just going to touch on a lot of elementary aspects related to C2 frameworks, and then we'll kind of like segue into developing it. And as these things go, we'll have our obligatory Who am I? So my name is Faan Rossouw. I'm a South African and I'm currently living in Canada. And I'm a researcher at Active Countermeasures, which some of you might know is the sister company of Antisyphon, part of the BHIS constellation. And I'm very fortunate because I get to spend a lot of my personal and professional time thinking about a question, which is how to detect C2 frameworks. And kind of in the quest to hopefully become somewhat competent at this, I approach it from both sides. So from the blue side, while many people approach this on the endpoint, I typically look at kind of like a network threat hunting approach, in which I use fingerprinting or statistical analysis to try to tease out communication patterns. And the tool will differ based on the question I'm asking, but it almost always involves some combination of Zeek or Python. And then lately, what I've been doing more and more really is creating C2 emulation tools. I mostly work in Go, but as these things go, you also have to develop. You often have to develop in C and C++ when you're interacting with the Win32 API and things like that. So there's always some of that involved too. And I just want to say as well that I really love teaching. I've taught many different things in my life, but I've never taught anything in security. And so I'm just very grateful for everyone being here and for giving me the opportunity to kind of like share my spiel today. As Zach already mentioned, all of this is a prelude to a 4-hour workshop I'll be doing in 2 days. I'll talk more about that in the end. I hope to convince you to join. It's going to be awesome. And all of that is in itself a prelude to a full 16-hour course that I'm hoping to bring out around August. And so I quickly want to talk about vibes, and by vibes, all I really mean are like the unspoken rules of today's container. And the reason for that is just so you have proper expectations of what we're going to do. And so the first thing is there's not going to be any demo or coding. And I've actually tried to be as non-technical as possible. Rather, what I want to offer is conceptual explorations. And the reason for that is I think technical understanding comes from praxis. And I think the best thing I can offer you today is maybe some interesting ways of looking at old or new ideas. And then that really helps form a foundation, like conceptual scaffolding, that when you go and develop technical understanding, it like helps things gel and kind of get into place better. So my goal is really not to give you anything that you could Google, or get from a GPT prompt. I hope to, if I succeeded, I will have given you a fresh perspective on something. And as we already mentioned, we'll invite some questions at the end. I want to say that originally this talk, when I timed it, was an hour and 40 minutes. So I had to cut it down a lot. Unfortunately, that meant is I had to let go of a lot of things that I actually really liked and wanted to keep. And so I'm committing, I want to underpromise, but in 2 weeks on my YouTube channel, which you can see there, I will have what I'm going to call the director's cut. And that will be the full unfettered hour and 40 minutes. I will re-record that and upload it there in case anyone is interested to go deeper in what I'm going to go into today. So let's quickly discuss the agenda. So I'm going to talk about what does C2 do. What I really mean with that is what is its role in modern threat campaigns? How does it work? I'm going to talk about a systems level analysis. How is C2 able to do what it does? And then we'll look a little bit closer at the three major components of C2. And then all of this is finally going to kind of like merge or segue into a quick discussion on C2 development and the workshop too. So let's start with what does C2 do? But I think let's dial it back even a bit and ask a more fundamental question, which is even like, what is malware? And so to do this, I want us all to imagine that we're a kid and it's a typical Saturday in this magical place called the 90s. Now, some of you were there with me. And so for those that unfortunately missed out, let me give you an idea of what it looked like. So it's a Saturday, so you obviously slept late, and then you'd wake up and have a big bowl of your favorite cereal. You'd watch Saturday morning cartoons because that's when the best cartoons were. And then at some point, you'd be kind of like roused out of your zombie-like state by the landline. We had one telephone we shared in the entire house. It would ring, and maybe your mom or your sister would answer. And on this specific Saturday, it's one of your best friends. And he's so excited, he can barely, he's hyperventilating, can barely tell you what's going on. But it turns out that one of our other friends got this insane game, and it's called Doom 2. And in Doom 2, like, just think back then we had games like Alley Cat and Wheel of Fortune. But in Doom 2, you flew into hell with a shotgun blasting demons. So for like a 12-year-old kid, this was the most metal shit of all time. Not only does our friend have this game, but he actually has the game on a series of floppies. And if we go there and pick this up, we can come and install and have Doom 2 on our own computers. And so naturally, we meet up on our bikes and we spend the rest of the day. We go, we fetch the floppies, we install it on our computers and all of our other friends' computers. And at the end of this long Saturday, you finally sit down, so goddamn excited to go shoot some demons. And you turn on the family computer, but the computer says no. Because unwittingly, you have been a vector for some kind of computer virus. And now your family computer doesn't work, and your dad's really mad at you, and you have to find some like smart older kid to come and fix this problem. And so this is like phenomenologically how I related to malware when I was a kid. We didn't call it malware, we called it viruses, and they were really agents of chaos. And sometimes they could brick your computer, but like Walker and Stoned and these things, they were mostly just like annoyances, like impeded your ability to completely use your computer. And if you think of the program as well as the people that created, I think of them as like inhabiting the trickster archetype. They're almost like diabolical merry pranksters because these things, they didn't have any real goal other than showing off, like sowing seeds of chaos, just to like mess with people, basically. But then something really big happened, and it affected not only human history at large, but also the evolution of malware itself, which was, of course, the internet. Now, the internet obviously existed way before the mid 90s, but around the mid 90s is when I feel like it really mainstreamified or became mainstream. And what I mean by that is most people started getting it in their house. So there's two ways in which it really impacted malware evolution. And the first one is the way malware was propagated. And the second one is it meant there was now money to be made. So when I say it changed the way it was propagated, I just explained to you what it took to get a virus back when essentially all our computers were air-gapped, right? You literally had to physically go get a floppy, go put it in your computer. It was a lot of effort. It took a lot of energy just for a virus to propagate itself. But once we were all essentially connected in one giant network, then just think of this as a probability sum. More people were more exposed to more malware more often. And so, whereas when I was a kid, somebody getting a computer virus was like an event. Like you'd be like, whoa, that kid has a virus. And be like, whoa, that's crazy. And by the end of the 90s, when we were all just downloading whatever, and that was the wild west of the internet back then as well, you would just get viruses all the time. You just had to like reformat your computer and reinstall Windows every few months. And so that was just par for the course. And then the other big thing that I think really changed malware was the introduction of money. And there's kind of two things that are separate but interrelated. The first thing is, again, back in the day, our computers didn't really have much of value on them. You'd maybe have a few games, maybe you'd have like Encarta Encyclopedia, and some people had word processors, but people didn't keep valuable documents on their computers. And then as computers became more integrated into our lives, this changed, right? And as soon as you have anything of value, then by definition, somebody can use that as leverage to extort you. Like, I'm going to take this thing of value away from you unless you give me some money, right? And then the other thing is it created the almost like a selective pressure for the professionalization of cybercrime. And what I mean by that is in any human phenomenon, so you can think of something like esports, when you introduce money into the picture, when it goes from kids playing computer games until they get old enough to get a real job, versus now you can play games and be in front of sellout stadiums earning millions of dollars, then it just changes. It evolves. The tactics evolve. The way people apply it evolve so rapidly. So I also don't want to give you the impression that the introduction of the internet just changed everything overnight. And also, truth be told, the first malware with the intent to make money was something called the AIDS Trojan, which preceded the internet. It's from about 1989. But then with the internet and a few other big kind of evolutionary steps, it really, I think, put things in motion to create the modern version of malware we know today. So I quickly want to touch on these other a few of these other major steps. Around 2013, we had these viruses called Crypto Star. It's just Crypto Asterisk, right? They were Crypto Locker or Crypto Wall. And probably you can guess that the big change was the introduction of Bitcoin. Because before then, though people could potentially extort you, it was hard for them to get money and not get caught. With the AIDS Trojan, you literally had to mail a check to a PO box in Panama. And then later in the late 2000s, we had these fake antivirus scareware, and you literally had to make a payment to a bank using your credit card. So something that could very easily be traced or reversed as well. But Bitcoin, as awesome as it is in many ways, obviously its kind of shadow side is it has enabled a lot of criminal activity by providing a mostly untraceable form of payment, right? A few years later, we have this acronym that I'm borrowing from Ryan Chapman, HUMOR, and it just means human operated ransomware. Now, the big thing about this is that before, malware was kind of like spray and pray. People would just put it out via spam email or drive-by downloads and hope somebody would get caught and then try to leverage that as an ability to get money from them. But now threat actors started like emulating nation state actors in which they targeted specific networks. So now it was more about spear phishing. And once they're inside, they don't just hope that they'll succeed. There's a sustained form of energy and engagement going towards to helping them drive towards the final goal. And then the final step I'll discuss here, which is probably, I would say, one of the biggest things, is RAS or ransomware as a service. And this one's interesting because there's no shift in the actual technology. It's almost just like a meme. It's just a mental construct. It's just changing the business model. And though it today can be quite complex with many different people involved, initial access brokers, data managers, negotiators, etc., back then, the original bifurcation was between developers and affiliates. So one person makes the tool and the playbook. The other person, maybe not as technically proficient, will actually go and do the entire engagement. Once they succeed, they'll split a share of the profit with the developer. And so all of this is really just what I want to do is create some context to make you understand where we are today and to help make better sense of what a modern threat campaign looks like. So modern threat campaign, there's a lot of good models out there. You have your MITRE ATT&CK, you have your cyber kill chain, etc. I'm going to use a different model today. It's my own model, and it is the simplest of all models. It only contains 3 components. The other models are superior in many ways, but for the purpose of our talk today, I think my model does a better job at highlighting the right places. So a modern threat campaign has 3 components. They are the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so with beginning, what I really just want to mean is obviously initial access. And initial access, it's all about having no access to a network, to having some access. And you can reframe this and also say, It's really about having no control on a network to having some control. And I want to emphasize the word some there because in order usually to achieve your final goal, you need more than some control. You need quite a lot of control. But what initial access most often represents is I think of it mentally like getting your foot in the door. It gives you the opportunity to do further things with the goal of, with the ability then to ultimately reach your ultimate goal. But it typically doesn't represent enough control yet. And so I'm going to skip to the end now. And the end is just achieving the final goal. And the reason I'm keeping it so generic is it really depends on the campaign, right? Whether it's espionage, nation state, or corporate espionage. But let's just say in most cases today, it involves some form of extortion. Can be ransomware, it can be double extortion, it can be triple extortion. So what the final goal usually looks like is they were able to deploy their cryptor, they were able to successfully negotiate, they're able to walk away with a bag of digital money, right? They successfully got money, they achieved their goal. And so then, like I said, between these two nodes, we have the middle. But I think the right way to think about it conceptually is kind of like this. And what I mean by that is the middle is the most complex. It usually takes the most time. It has the most different steps. And it can also vary the most because, again, it really depends on each single campaign what exactly constitutes the middle. But in most campaigns, most often, it will typically be things like creating some form of persistence, enumerating, exfilling data, harvesting credentials, AV-EDR evasion, lateral movement to other systems, privilege escalation, pivoting to other systems, etc. So I'm getting kind of cotton mouthy here. I don't know why, but I'll just sip on this water every now and then. Great. So to go from our initial access to our final goal, we have all these different steps. And typically, they're all kind of discrete steps, right? Each one helps you move forward, move the puck forward, and gives you the ability then to do other steps with the goal of kind of finally arriving at the final goal. So they're all kind of different. They all connect with one another, but the one thing they all have in common is command and control. Because typically when you have initial access, one of the first things you want to do is create persistence and or establish a C2 channel. And the reason for that is I want you to think about command and control differently. It's not a discrete step. It's not a box you're going to check off. Rather, it is the foundation. It is the thing that gives you the ability to do all the other things. So all these other tasks in the middle are often mediated or made possible by or using a channel created by command and control. And so the right way to think about command and control then is, like I already mentioned, the foundation. And that's because this is all about control. It's giving you the control. What control? Well, back what I just said about initial access. You have some control, but not necessarily enough control. So that extra control, conceptual control you need, well, that is typically provided by C2. Now, it's not the only option. You can use C2 frameworks, you can use RATs. Some people say it's the same thing as C2. I slightly disagree, although you could probably make an argument that a C2 is a form of a RAT. But you can also leverage legitimate channels, right? Like RMMs, especially if the target network is using something like AnyDesk or Screen Connect. You can use those channels. They're especially powerful because they allow affiliates, which, as I also mentioned, are not necessarily as technically savvy as developers. They allow them to interact with the target system as if it's a system right in front of them, right? With the C2, you have to learn a new tool, and it can be quite technical, right? And then often you have other protocols, and perhaps even initial access was obtained through another protocol, like publicly exposed RDPs as one of the top ways to achieve initial access, actually, or SSH or VNC. And these two, to different degrees, offer you some form of control, some ability to do something on the target endpoint, right? But often what you'll see, and this is the one resource I most often share with other people, it's called DFIR report. Some people call it a DFIR report. But essentially, they've just created these really good honey nets, and they basically lure actual threat actors into exerting campaigns on it, and then they write reports about this. And what you'll see very often is that they typically use a combination of all the things you see above, because it's obviously some form of redundancy, and also you can use different channels of control for different goals. But it almost always involves some form of C2, and today, very commonly, it's still Cobalt Strike. Cool. So we're going to jump to our next section now, in which I really want to talk about how does C2 work. And like I said, I want to talk about how does C2 work on a systems level. How can it do the things it's able to do? And so I'm going to start with a quote from the COO of Active Countermeasures, which is malware does not break the rules, it bends them. And this is a quote that I've sat with for some time, and it actually has a lot of meanings, like layers and depth to it. And one of them, at least, is, when thinking of malware, don't think of it as like some special type of software that can do black magic or has types of functions or languages or expressions or protocols that nothing else can use. It doesn't. It does the exact same thing as legitimate software. It's just very often the case that there are things that you can do but not supposed to do, and it just does that. And so with this frame in mind, we can actually think at its core of C2 as just being a spin, a riff on the client and server model. A client and server model that bends the rules. And this is the same client and server model used throughout, our backends to be able for two hosts to transfer information to each other across a network. Now, typically when you learn what a client and server is, you typically see a diagram like this. And then you'll see a workstation on the left and some box or a server rack on the right. And you're told the thing on the left is the client and the thing on the right is the server. And that is technically correct. But I also feel like it's kind of mistaking a specific instance, a very common instance, but an instance nonetheless, of a client and server for a more universal concept. And so I actually want to take a quick moment to just explore what is this more universal concept, because I think it's a very empowering thing to understand, not only with malware, but just information security in general. So I'm going to propose that a client and server, it's not immutable or intrinsic. I just mean like there's no device that is inherently a client or inherently a server. Rather, what client and server is it's a description of a relationship, or even more accurately, it's a description of a relationship at any given moment in time. And I feel like I'm starting to sound very abstract, and it's maybe even more confusing right now. So I want to show you just how incredibly simple this is, by just grounding this into a simple little analogy, which is giving and receiving a massage. And so I learned in preparation for this talk that the term masseuse is apparently like not PC anymore. And so I'm going to be referring to a massage provider and a massage recipient as the two people involved in this interaction. And so for my demonstration, I've asked two other Canadians, Terence and Philip, to help us illustrate this. And so if the two of them are standing right here, and I ask you which of the two are the massage provider and which of the two are the massage recipient, there's obviously no way for you to be able to answer this question, right? But if we hung out for just a few seconds and we observe them, and suddenly this is taking place, well, now if I ask you that same question, you can of course say that, well, Terence is the massage provider and Philip is the massage recipient. Okay, but what if we hang out for another few seconds or minutes and we look again, and now this is happening? Well, now in this case, it's obviously the inverse, and now Philip is the provider and Terence is the recipient. And so once again, if they're standing in front of us and I ask you who's the massage provider and who's the recipient, The correct answer is it depends. Well, what does it depend on? It depends on who is giving and who is receiving the massage at any given moment in time. This does, however, not mean that both of them are equally suited to give massages. For example, Terence might love giving massages. He went to school, he studied shiatsu and Swedish and Thai massage. He knows all the techniques. He's developed considerable forearm and muscular strength, and he can sustain giving massages for numerous hours each day. So with all that in mind, let's go look back at our original client and server model again. So if it's a description of a moment in time is what defines client and server, well, what exactly is defining it in this case? It's of course the fact that it's the machine on the left, the host on the left, that is sending the request, and it is the machine on the right that is sending the response. That's what defines them as being client and server. So if I took this exact same diagram, but I just flip that around, it's the one on the right making the request and the other one responding. Well, now it's the one on the right that is the client and the one on the left that is the server. And so the question then is, if it's not immutable or intrinsic to the machine, what is making the one a client and the one a server? And it's of course the fact that there's software on each. Software on the left that's sending requests, software on the right that's receiving the request and responding to it. And so finally, we can bring all this together and we can say that a client and server is the description of a relationship at a given moment in time that is mediated by software. Cool. So with all that now in mind, let's explore how C2 works. And so I want you to look at this picture and I want you to imagine on the right, this green fuzz is a corporate LAN. Now, what makes this a LAN? Well, it has a host. Probably has a lot of different hosts, but it at the very least has this one single host, and that's the only one we're going to worry about for the moment. It also has a firewall, but more importantly, it's a single node of ingress and egress, and it gets to decide what's in this network and what is not in this network. So it defines this LAN from not this LAN, from everything that's not this LAN. And so in this little scenario in our little LAN, the local host receives the email and it has a juicy job offer attached to it and they can't resist. So they want to look at it. They open the Excel spreadsheet and enable macros. And it activates, of course, a hidden macro script, a little stager. It goes out to a predefined IP. It downloads another piece of software. This software is then transferred to it, injected into memory, executed, and it starts running. And now that it's running, it is sending requests, and the system out there is responding to it. So request, response, it's probably very obvious. What we're looking at here is a C2 client and a C2 server. Now, I want to dig into this a little bit more just now, but while we're here, I just want to put emphasis on the fact that the direction matters. Meaning it's important that the machine on the network is out sending requests and it's the machine outside sending responses back. The reason for this is simply, and I just want to say when you discuss these things, there's always exceptions and ways to break the rules, but just in the majority of times, most well-configured fire hosts are not going to allow any random external host to connect inbound to a local host on the LAN. But most firewalls, most of the time, will allow a local host to connect outbound to an unknown IP, especially over HTTP or HTTPS and DNS, because they often need to visit websites or resolve addresses and connect to servers they don't yet know the IP of. So most of the time that's allowed, and therefore it's typically the system that is infected locally that will initiate the relationship. Now, I want to quickly speak about terminology. I told you that is the C2 client, but actually most of the time, nobody ever calls that the C2 client, even though technically in a client-server model, it is a client. And there's almost, I don't know if it's a tradition, but in many C2 frameworks, they just make up their own term for this. So Cobalt Strike calls it beacons, Havoc calls it demons, Covenant calls it grunts, Sliver calls it implants, Mythic and Merlin, they call it agents. And I also really like the term agents. I think it most best conceptually encapsulates what it is. And so I'm going to stick with the term C2 agents for the rest of this talk. And so speaking of the client, there is actually something called the C2 client. And it's because an operator is somebody that is using or interacting with the C2 framework, but they're not typically doing so with the server. The server is more what you can think of as the logical node of the entire operation. But they typically use another system that has the front end or the UI. If they want to run a command or enumerate or anything like that, see their command history, that's on a different machine. And we typically call this the C2 client. Now, this might seem confusing because why is this the client? I thought the other one was the client. But once again, a client and a server is a description of a relationship. And just because they're a client and a server doesn't mean these two are not a client and server either, because they are, right? It is the UI front end is also a client in relationship to the C2 server. So I want to go through like one little simple conceptual round of how it would work to execute a command from the client to the agent. So let's say the operator wants to enumerate. They want to know what's the username on the endpoint host. So they issue the command, who am I? Now, typically the client and the server in modern frameworks, they'll have something like WebSockets. So it's a persistent connection. So that's just immediately pushed to the server. And it stays now on the server until the next time the C2 client, sorry, the C2 agent will check in. And remember, the C2 agent checks in and it asks, do you have any jobs for me? And in this case, the C2 server will say, in fact, I do. I want you to run the command, who am I? So the C2 agent runs the command. In this case, the user is called Mr. Derp. And the next time they connect back, now probably using a post request and embedding the answer in the post body, they'll hit a different endpoint and then they'll send the information back to the C2 server. And now, once again, because it probably has a persistent WebSocket connection, it can immediately push the information back to a C2 client. Great, so that's kind of like how it works in its most simple, everything trimmed elementary form. But you're more often than not going to see different variations on this. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes just to explore some of these variations. Oh yeah, he's happy that he knows it's Mr. Derp. So the first common variation I want to explore are you can of course have multiple agents, right? There can of course be multiple systems on the target network that are infected. Now sometimes this can communicate back to the same server, or other times it can communicate to a different server. And this is sometimes in bigger operations, you can think of it's communicating low and slow. You can call it a zombie beacon or a backup agent. And what it really is, it's communicating very lightly, so it has less of a chance to be caught. And let's say in the case that the main C2 server is burnt, compromised, then you can switch over to use that as the primary and then hopefully replace it with another backup. But sometimes, let's say you pivoted onto a database server and it's on a network segment that doesn't communicate egress at all, then you obviously don't want to make a direct connection to a server. So agents can also communicate with one another, and that's typically called agent to agent. You can use something like SMB or name pipes. And in this way, remember the one on the bottom, the purple one, it's still communicating to the server. It's just proxying its communication through the existing one, the orange one. So redirectors is a big thing too, and it has multiple uses. For the most simplest use of a redirector, just think of it as getting a disposable VM and running a proxy. You can run something like SOCAT on it, and it just proxies all the communication between the agent and the server. And you might think, well, what's the point of this? The point of this is to create one step between the actual server and the agent, because this basically hides the identity of the server. Now, because remember, if we do a trace file here, they're going to see the agent not communicating to the server. They're going to see the agent communicating to the redirector. Now, in case they get caught, it's much easier to create a new redirector. It's much cheaper, more disposable than it is to create a whole new server. So essentially, in this case, it's just an insurance policy. In case I get caught, the costs are less severe. But you can have multiple redirectors. Now, first, if one gets caught, it means the operation's never offline, right? Because you already have backup. But another thing that's really awesome about multiple redirectors, it offers a form of network evasion mediated by what we can call host rotation strategy. And essentially, you can just think of it as it's two different benefits. The first thing is if I'm communicating to three different hosts instead of one, either the total duration or the total connection count is going to be divided by three, right? And probabilistically, the more you communicate with hosts, the more likely it is to garner scrutiny and the more likely it is to get caught. So you're just diluting your communication by a third. But with host rotation strategy, you can choose the way in which you communicate. So for example, you can go ABC, ABC, ABC. That's not doesn't really offer much of advantage, but perhaps you can randomly choose A, B, or C, A, B, or C, or you can do something like randomly connect to A, B, or C for a random amount between 20 and 40 connections, and then do that again, right? So you can start adding additional layers of abstraction, which just breaks patterns, which can allow people to get detected on the network. And then, of course, you can have multiple operators, in which case they don't want to be sitting at the same in front of the same UI. So you can have multiple clients. And with things like Mythic, they even allow different people to have different levels of permissions. You obviously want, in most modern frameworks now also have databases. You want to be able to save state in case you lose your connection, you want to start again. You want all the information on the connections. And again, I'm a huge Mythic fanboy. It's really awesome. And it saves all your command and output history as well. So it's great to have a database involved too. All that to say, obviously, I just showed a few different elements, but there's no there's no set way in which this can take place, right? It really depends on the complexity of the actual threat campaign, the actors. Is it just kind of a quick smash and grab, or is this a multi-month long, nation state espionage where they have unlimited funds being thrown at them? All to say, you can take every single element that I just shared and combine it in a near infinite amount of ways, right? Cool. So I hope that gave you some idea of how it works at a systems level. I want to now talk a little bit more about what we just discussed as the agent, the server, and the client. And I just want to zoom in and talk about this in a little bit more depth. I'm also going to mention that this is one of the parts I mentioned in the beginning. I had to distill a lot and cut a lot out. A lot of the details that I cut out was from this section because I just wanted to present you guys with a more overall view. So if you want to go deeper into anything here and nerd out on it, just watch for the director's cut to be released on my YouTube. And then we can talk about some of these things in much more depth. Like, I know people love nerding out about languages and what's the best language. So I talk about that a lot in there. So as far as C2 server goes, like I already explained, it's the logical node. So what does it do? Well, it handles, it creates, it removes, it manages connections, listeners, handlers. By handlers, your routes, your router, your routes. It handles data flow and data management. What is, is it a struct? Does it get serialized and deserialized? All that, the different forms of data. What is it? How to logically define it? How to handle it? It's also another very important component is middleware, is being able to authenticate who connects to it and encrypt and all of those things. One thing, for example, I don't know if anyone here has worked a lot with Cobalt Strike, but they don't really authenticate beacons. So if you've ever had a Cobalt Strike server open, you'll just look and suddenly you have all these random beacons connecting to you. And it's because there are these services out there called beacon scanners that are basically just looking for standard signatures of C2 servers, and then they'll connect to them. And they just do this to get the IP and then, package it as sell it as threat intelligence, basically. But in I think like with Merlin and Mythic, they do a great job, whether it's JWT or something like that. Just also ensure that whoever's connecting with you is supposed to be connecting to you. So you don't need to create firewall rules to do that at level 3. So my personal thought is, because we're basically creating a networking backend server here, the best language for this is a language that's optimized for the backend. I personally think Go is the best suited to write a C2 server in. I'm also going to show you what other people write in, and I think that it's largely the consensus. But some people are really attached to OOP, and if that's your jam, then C# seems to be a reasonable choice as well. But as these language debates goes, guys, like different strokes for different folks. What makes you happy, code in that, but it doesn't mean each tool is equally suited to the job at the end of the day. For our C2 agent, it also needs some basic networking, right? It's going to communicate back and forth with the server, but that's a really tiny component of what an agent does. By far, the vast majority of what it's going to do is actions on the endpoints, right? Interacting with the host. And so a lot of it, I'm writing Win32 API. Of course, I know direct syscalls is kind of like, very much in vogue and stuff like that, but it's interacting with the Windows architecture at the end of the day, whether that's at the NTAPI or Win32 or kernel level or whatever. And you can think of the 4 major actions of what they do. You can more or less think of them belonging in 4 categories: uploading data to the target, downloading, exfiltrating data, executing. So if you have the ability to execute shellcode or buffs or cuffs or anything, if you can create a new process successfully, there's very little that you can't do. And then commands, that's everything that doesn't fall in the first 3 category. Let's say you want to archive some data because you want to exfil it, right? But to do the things, to create the ability to do things for the agent, that's actually the easy part. The much bigger challenge when you think about an agent is you want to do the things and not get caught, right? And especially today, most of your time and effort is going to think about like evasion and things like that. And so the lingua franca of the Win32 API, it's also sometimes referred to as C-flavored C++ because it's basically fully compatible with C, but it uses some ideas like RAI and classes and simple templates borrowed from C++, just to make, I imagine, to make managing a multi-million-dollar code base a little bit simpler than just using pure C. But in whatever language you're going to use, you are going to have to know something about C and C++ because that is, like I said, that's the base, that's the lingua franca. Um, I'll go into much more depth than each of these other. I have a slide for each language in the director's cut. But I guess I can just briefly mention Rust and Go are kind of like more modern. Rust has many of the benefits of C++, plus it enforces memory safety at compile time, which is awesome. So less likely to blow up if you're not super competent. I love Go for agent development as well, but it has a major kind of like cloud, which is it creates a really big binary because you compile it with the Go runtime. So it has the garbage collector and the concurrency system. Some people don't think it's a huge issue. I don't really have a strong opinion on that, but it is a joy to work with. And then Zig and Nim are kind of like modern, more popular modern emerging contenders, I would say, and they each have their kind of like their unique selling proposition. But with emerging languages, you're always going to be you're going to be part of the group that's the frontier, that's figuring shit out. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for people just starting out. But some people are naturally attracted to be part of the pioneers. So if you feel called to do so, go for it. And then as far as our C2 client goes, at the end of the day, it's still a human that's going to interact with the software, right? So it doesn't really matter how good the features are. If the simplest feature is illogically buried under 4 different steps and it's a nightmare to work with, people aren't going to want to use your framework necessarily. So the user experience, and by that, it's also beyond just the visual eye candy, right? It's really important. And there's 3 major categories you can think of. There's your classic GUI, and you have terminal UIs, and we have what's more growing in popularity, I would say, is web-based UIs. But actually, let's look at I compile here what I consider the big nine. Maybe Covenant shouldn't necessarily be here. It hasn't been updated in a while. And also Empire, that's the BC fork I'm talking about here, not the original Harmjoy one. The top three, I added a dollar sign, which means they're the only three that here that you have to pay for. And what that means is I'm not fully sure what it's actually written in. That's just based on the basic information I got. But if we look at server, of the nine, we have five actually have their backend written in Go. And I think even like Cobalt Strike is written in Java just because it was created. At the time it was created, that was kind of like in vogue, right? But I would venture to say if Cobalt Strike was rewritten today, had to be rewritten, they'd probably also do it in Go. Covenant, the creator of that Ryan Cobb, just really wanted to do everything in C sharp. So you can see the backend, the agent, and the front end. Blazor is also part of .NET, so it did all that in .NET. With agent, we can see actually quite a lot of variation, but you can see at the top C, C, assembly, C++. And then Merlin and Sliver both do Go. People love Sliver, but your binaries are 15 megabytes instead of when they could have been 1 megabyte in C. Again, it's debatable whether that's a real issue or not. And then Mythic, I'm just going to fan out over Mythic again. I think Mythic was so brilliant in that it realized one of the biggest challenges with modern frameworks is just how quickly tools get discovered and rewritten. And so instead of investing a lot of energy in making agents, he decided, I'm going to create the best framework to make it as easy as possible for other people to develop their own agents and easily interface with it, whatever language or thing you want to use. And then we can see with Empire as well. Of course, the original Empire was completely written in PowerShell. It was called PowerShell Empire, but they have now C Sharp, Python, and Go options as well. And then finally, as far as UIs go, next time I should have some fisherman's friends with me. I'll make a mental note. As far as UIs go, you can see four of them use GUIs. And Havoc has a GUI written in Qt, which is C++, because the creator is a savage, basically. And then Merlin and Sliver, I think they both use Bubble Tea, which is a very popular Go library for creating very beautiful terminal UIs. And then we have JavaScript web UI with Mythic. We have Blazor, which I said is .NET. And then Empire actually, it comes standard with a PowerShell terminal UI, but you can download Starkiller, which gives you a Vue.js, which is a JavaScript web UI as well. Obviously, like a big thing that I have to unfortunately kind of gloss over a bit is the way your C2 communicates, right? And you immediately have a choice between is it persistent, right? Or beaconing. And what I mean by beaconing is connect, request, response, disconnect, right? So there's a disconnect each time. With persistence, you're still going to have sleep, but you're going to connect, request, response, sleep, no disconnect, request, response, etc. And the trade-off there is really about how you make noise. With persistence, you're going to rack up connection time. And with beaconing, you're going to rack up connections, right? There's going to be a lot of connections between the local host and your C2 server. So you can choose one of these, but also I want to encourage you to start thinking about them as maybe two nodes on a spectrum, and you can combine the two, right? You don't have to be strictly persistent or strictly disconnect every single time. One thing about jitter, so the time that passes between subsequent requests from the agent, if we do that with a consistent amount every time, that's called our sleep or our delay, let's say 60 seconds. Well, if it's 60 seconds every single time, that also starts standing out, right? And so jitter is just a way to introduce some variability or randomness to it. So you can say 60 seconds plus or minus anything between 0 and 20 seconds, right? And data jitter applies that same idea, but to the packet size, because by far the most common connection type or communication type for a C2 is the agent asking, do you have a job for me? And the server saying, no, I don't. And without data jitter, that packet size is going to be the exact same size every single time. And the only framework I have really seen introduce this is Merlin, but I do believe Cobalt Strike has added this feature as well. You just add random padding, some junk data to your packet, so it's not always the exact same size. You obviously want to think about obfuscation and, like, also remember as well ways to authenticate. Then the big one is what protocol you're going to use. Are you going to rely on what I think of as the big three, or HTTP and HTTPS and DNS, or C3, which you can think of as leveraging APIs, whether it's Discord or Telegram or Dropbox, use these APIs. Or you can use something smaller, less known. You can use Ping, you can use NTP. At the end of the day, whatever you choose, it has to make sense, right? So if you choose a protocol, but there's no reason for this amount of communication to be happening over this protocol, it's probably not a great choice, right? Don't think about your ability to evade detection as choosing the obscurest thing possible. Think of it as the ability to blend in and look most normal as possible. That's really what the goal with all of this is to blend in as much as you can, to look as normal as you can. And there's just a few other considerations I think are worth mentioning. I see I'm running out of time, so I'll just kind of like motor through these, but we're almost done. Is the UX beyond UI? Is it easy to install, for example, or does it always break and you need constant updates? Portability, I think this is another place Go shines. On what operating system can your program run? Stability, there's a lot of things, good and bad, you can say about Cobalt Strike. I think one of the reasons for its enduring legacy is certainly because it's an incredibly stable network, stable framework. And if you nail everything else 10 out of 10, but your framework has a habit of crashing when it matters most, people aren't going to use your framework, right? And then architecture, it used to be more monolithic. So Metasploit wanted to do like exploitation and post-exploitation kind of all in one. The problem with that is just things change so quickly. So because you're doing so many things, you're constantly having to update everything, your entire application. Whereas I think Mythic it's designed based on the times, which is things change so quickly. So let's make it as extensible and modular as possible. So we only upgrade what needs to be changed, what needs to be changed. We only change what needs to be changed. Yeah. Cool. And so final slide. I want to talk about the workshop on the 25th of April. So I actually omitted the most important thing when you build a C2 is choosing a really cool name. And when I was developing this course, my wife and we just watched Nosferatu from Robert Eggers. So I called it Orlok C2, Yasferatu. And we're going to do a server and agent in Golang. We are going to do our client in Vue.js. It's going to have a very simple command interpreter because the goal is to build the entire framework, not zoom in on the agent too much. You're going to learn awesome key architectural principles. So I want to say, even if you are not in offensive security, even if you have no intention of ever building a C2, I think it's an awesome project to take on, especially as a beginner, because you're going to learn such a wide variety of key skills that are totally transferable to other forms of development as well. And I also tried to really give the most that I can. So I made it the longest that it could be for the cheapest that it could be. And even in the course, I'm going to give you so many extra what I call breadcrumbs. So the ability for you to go beyond and also establish communication channels with me so that we can continue learning and growing past just Friday's workshop together. And so my call to action, join us. But if you don't want to join us, sorry. If you don't want to join us, you can I'm going to be releasing many more videos. That's my YouTube channel and my personal website. I already have a few free courses there, and I will have a lot of more free courses coming out this year. I have a number in the pipeline, all on this topic, all on malware development and C2 development. So thank you. I hope your guys' experiences are unforgettable. And so that being the case, I think we have a few minutes for some questions.
Hey, Faan. I've been watching from the backstage. I watched this entire thing, and it was so good. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise to the stage today. We do have just a couple of minutes for some questions. Yeah. The good news is for those that are attending through Zoom, if we don't get to your question now, you can join us in the Zoom Q&A. which is a breakout room, which we'll do directly following just a few questions here. So let's see if we can get to some, because there are a few questions in the Q&A already. One is, in the case of a redirector is offline, are the downstream agents then orphaned?
Well, right. So with redirector, I just showed the first slide with one, just to kind of put emphasis on the 1 degree remove. But in all honesty, you'd want to, I would say, at least always have to, right? The redundancy is just the foundational principle of good OPSEC in general. So I would say if you only had one and you orphan your agents, which is probably what would happen. But remember, sorry, I'm kind of like going all over the place now. That's a bad design. But on the other hand, too, remember you can always pre-seed your agents with multiple IPs that they should try and connect out to. So even if they are orphaned, maybe they'll try to reconnect to the same redirector, but maybe you could set it so that after a set amount of time or failed attempts, you could try one of these other IPs and then use that to create a new redirector, right?
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Let's see here. I'm throwing in a link to your workshop because people are asking about how can I sign up for this thing? There you go. I'm going to put another one in here just real quick, and then I'll get you another question. And let's see here. Now we got that one out of the way. I love how the thing just scrolls right past me once it moves on me. I don't make it move; it moves itself. Does the C2 server use some kind of MQ, or is the traffic not sufficient for that?
So with MQ, I'm actually sorry, I don't know what that means. Is that like a load balancer?
I was hoping you would know that maybe,
Uh,
yeah, I wasn't
I-
100% on that. I thought maybe it's quality assurance or uh, not quality assurance, but
Yeah, I don't
so
know what MQ is. If I can intuit, maybe I'm completely wrong, but just remember when we typically talk about servers, right? If you are into backend engineering, and one of the big problems with servers that you constantly have to solve is the amount of traffic, right? So a lot of your design is based on that. But a C2 server, you don't have that problem, right? Because it's not like you have a public server where you can get thousands or millions of people trying to connect to you at the same time. You'll maybe have a handful, right? So I hope that was what you meant with it. And if not, feel free to
chat is
clarify.
letting us know that it is message queuing.
Oh, well, I think that's kind of, you know, that would depend on exactly the design you're using, right? So that your API design and stuff too. But certainly if you look at, I think Mythic uses Kafka, right, as for the message handling. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a better answer for you than that right now. But I would say it would depend on, whether you're using gRPC or, whatever you're using.
Awesome. Well, Fawn, thank you for a phenomenal talk with us.
Ah,
Right.
ended with a dad joke, bro.
That's
Yeah.
right. Had to bring it in. I was sitting on. I was like, I gotta say this. I gotta say this. Thank you so much for your time, Discord. I hope you
Yeah.
enjoyed that. But it is the top of the hour, which means we have to jump into the breakout room for that Zoom Q&A. So the only way you can get into that is if you registered through Zoom and you are watching through Zoom. Then you can look at the bottom of your Zoom panel there, and it will have a more area, and you'll see breakout rooms. When you click on that, you'll see one that says Ask Antisyphon Anything. You click the join button, and that's where we are going to go. And we will see you there. Discord, thank you so much. Thanks for keeping it entertaining as
Thanks,
always. And
everyone.
we'll see you next week. Fun. I'll see you in the Q&A here just
Yeah.
momentarily. Have a great
Cool,
one, everyone.
cool.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.